There are moments when the world tilts, quietly without warning, revealing seams in reality that were never meant to split open. A fossil older than history, a sound rising from the deepest dark on Earth, a map that redraws a continent long before we were supposed to see it. These are not stories whispered by campfires. They are records buried, redacted, sealed behind doors that were never supposed to unlock. Yet evidence has a strange habit of surviving. It clings to stone, to ice, to the ocean floor, waiting for the day someone finally looks closely enough to understand. And when you do, when you follow each thread to where it truly leads, something unsettling happens. The world stops feeling familiar. Lock your doors, put on your headphones, because after this video, you'll never see forbidden discoveries the same way again. The anomalous fossil that shouldn't exist. The hillside above Cross Creek looks ordinary. Quiet farmland, thin trees, narrow trails carved by deer and time. But beneath that soil lies one of the most stubborn fractures in North American history, a set of fragments, tools, and burned bone that should not exist in the timeline we were all taught. When archaeologist James Adovazio first entered the narrow opening of Meadowcroft rock shelter in 1973, he expected a routine excavation. Instead, layer after layer revealed a sequence that contradicted almost every accepted model of human arrival in the Americas. Buried deep beneath the rockfall, far older than any Clovis artifact, were tiny blades, sharpened flakes, and preserved seeds stained with charcoal. Each carbon test returned a date that strained belief. 16,000, 17,000, in some strata, even 19,000 years old. The data circulated quietly among academic circles. Some were curious, many were hostile. A discovery that old didn't just challenge a theory, it threatened an entire framework. Several institutions refused to publish the findings unless the dates were reassessed. One lab, which had initially confirmed the early carbon readings, later withdrew its statement without explanation. A geologist working with the team recalled being told, "Classify any inconsistencies as sediment contamination. It's simpler for everyone." But the strata weren't contaminated. The deposits were sealed beneath collapses untouched for millennia, with no sign of intrusion. The stone tools matched no known cultural tradition on the continent, and the soil chemistry aligned perfectly with the timeline Adovazio proposed. Every test said the same thing. Someone was here long before the first humans were supposed to cross from Siberia. Then came the missing notes. Early field logs documenting the deepest levels reportedly vanished from a departmental archive during a routine transfer. Photographs meant to accompany a paper draft were wiped from the university's storage system. A researcher who attempted to speak publicly about the anomalies found her scheduled lecture abruptly cancelled due to space conflicts that didn't exist. Still, the evidence refused to disappear. In 1992, new radiocarbon tests were performed with updated protocols. They confirmed, again, that humans occupied Meadowcroft thousands of years before the Clovis culture appeared. The pushback intensified. Critics claimed rodent burrows might have moved older materials downward. Others argued for miscalibration, yet no burrow patterns were found, and recalibration only strengthened the results. By the early 2000s, the debate had expanded beyond archaeology. Geologists highlighted that the region's layers were remarkably stable, making natural mixing all but impossible. Botanists noted that the seeds recovered from the fire pits belonged to plants that would have required deliberate collection, and lithic analysts pointed out that the tools resembled traditions seen nowhere else, hinting at a migration older and more complex than anyone dared propose. But the most unsettling detail wasn't what was found, it was what wasn't. If humans lived here 20,000 years ago, their story, tools, camps, migrations, should appear elsewhere across the continent. Instead, Meadowcroft stands alone, a solitary fingerprint pressed into stone long before its time. Some researchers believe the site survived only because of the cave's unique protection. Others suspect that traces of early human presence may have been discovered in other locations, only to be dismissed, reclassified, or quietly shelved because they contradicted a narrative too entrenched to rewrite. A retired technician who had processed early samples once admitted, "We weren't told to lie, we were told not to complicate things." But history doesn't care about convenience. It waits, buried patiently, until someone is willing to listen. And at Meadowcroft, the earth whispered a truth no one was prepared to accept. that long before the first recorded footsteps reached these lands, another people had already stood beneath this same rock, lit their fires, shaped their tools, and vanished without leaving anything but questions. But the oldest stories don't fade, they surface, and when they rise, they tend to bring more than answers with them. The signals coming from inside the glacier. High above the tree line, where the wind moves like a living blade, and the world narrows into white silence, the Juneau icefield hides a presence older than every forest, road, and memory below it. Ice is supposed to be mute, cracking, shifting, grinding under its own weight. But in the winter of 2014, a series of seismic sensors placed along the coast began recording something far stranger: rhythms. At first, geologists believed they were harmonic tremors, natural vibrations produced when glacial ice fractures in smooth waves. But these pulses weren't random. They came in steady intervals, separated by precise pauses, as though something beneath the ice were moving with intention. A researcher reviewing the spectrograms late one evening reportedly murmured, "This isn't ice breaking, it's repeating itself." When more sensors were placed along the eastern ridges, the signals grew clearer. The frequency dipped and rose like breath. Patterns converged around a deep crevasse system no drone could safely enter. Each recording carried a faint, sub-bass thrum that technicians described as felt more than heard, pressing into the chest the way sound does inside a cathedral. For a moment, the ice didn't seem like frozen water. It seemed alive. Then an anomaly surfaced. One of the sensors captured a rising modulation that matched no known glacial signature. Its waveform curled upward, elongated, and then steadied into a hum that lasted nearly 40 seconds. When the team played it through studio monitors, several of them turned toward the door instinctively, as if expecting something to step inside. The recording was immediately flagged for internal review. Days later, instructions arrived from the regional office. No public release of interpretive statements. Data could be logged, but conclusions were to remain strictly provisional. One geophysicist familiar with the directive later said it felt less like scientific caution and more like someone trying to keep speculation buried under administrative ice. But curiosity grows in cold places. In 2017, a graduate team conducted a winter-long experiment, placing hydrophones into melt shafts. What they retrieved months later shook them. The audio was faint, but the pattern was unmistakable. 3 pulses, the slow swell, then silence. The signature repeated at intervals that suggested movement deeper within the field, as if something large were shifting far beneath the layers of compressed snow. Some argued that a hidden subglacial stream was to blame. Others insisted the pulses resembled low-frequency resonance, the kind produced when a hollow chamber expands or contracts. But the Juneau icefield isn't known for such caverns, and even if they existed, natural cavities do not expand in deliberate, rhythmic intervals. In 2022, a fragment of audio from an unlisted research drive leaked among a small group of university alumni. Those who heard it claimed the sound was unlike any ice quake. Instead of the sharp crack of fracturing glaciers, the recording carried an eerie rising swell, slow, heavy, almost like the groan of something vast shifting in its sleep. A former technician described it with a single line. "It didn't sound like the glacier was breaking. It sounded like the glacier was reacting." Yet nothing definitive ever appeared in the published literature. Papers remained incomplete. Field notes referenced unresolved spectral anomalies, and the sensors closest to the crevasses, those that had captured the strongest pulses, were quietly removed during a maintenance cycle, replaced with newer models that, for reasons never explained, were positioned farther from the active zone. Even now, hikers sometimes report feeling vibrations underfoot on still days, when no meltwater flows and no storms shake the valley. Gentle tremors, rhythmic, almost like something shifting beneath a thick blanket of snow. Because if the ice is making these sounds, breathing, resonating, answering, then the question isn't what's happening to the glacier, it's what the glacier is hiding. And when the last recording faded into silence, something under the ice continued to move. The deep-sea signal that shouldn't be possible. The ocean has a way of swallowing sound. Even storms vanish into its depths like whispers smothered by a sleeping giant. But on a still day in early December, something rose from the floor of the Pacific, so loud, so impossibly powerful, that the equipment designed to monitor nuclear activity nearly tore itself apart trying to record it. The NOAA hydrophone array captured a rising organic roar unlike anything documented before. The signal was triangulated to an area thousands of miles from any shipping route, volcanic activity, or known geological fault. Researchers expected machinery noise or seismic distortion. Instead, what they heard was a frequency curve that matched nothing but life. Life so massive it defied biology as we understand it. Inside NOAA's Pacific lab, analysts gathered around the spectrogram as one technician muttered, "That's impossible." Another whispered that if the sound truly came from an animal, its body would have to be longer than any blue whale ever recorded. Hours later, the raw audio files were quietly pulled from internal servers. Several staff recalled the moment the classification label above the folder changed, first to restricted, then to archived, and finally to non-public research anomaly. Official statements drifted over the years: ice carving, instrumentation error, a natural event of no concern. But the early spectrographs, briefly available before being reassigned, show waveforms too smooth, too intentional, too sustained. Marine biologists who reviewed the original data claimed the sound carried harmonics that should only come from a moving throat, not fracturing ice. And then there were the follow-up reports. 6 months after the signal, deep-sea sensors near the same coordinates detected a series of low-frequency pulses traveling along the thermocline, steady, rhythmic, almost searching, a pattern that did not match any known seismic signature. When a journalist later requested the files under a federal disclosure request, the reply arrived in a single sentence: "No responsive records exist, but the ocean remembers. And sometimes it answers in ways we weren't prepared to hear." But if the deep can speak with that kind of force, what happens when it begins to speak again? The lab notes: NASA locked away. On the Antarctic plateau, sound dies quickly. Wind scrapes across the ice. Storms roll in like distant walls. And then, nothing. Just the hum of generators and the brittle creak of a station holding its ground over miles of frozen secrecy. In the winter of 1983, a small joint research team was stationed far from any shipping lane or flight path, running atmospheric experiments for a project quietly supported by NASA. Their job was simple on paper: record background radiation, monitor the upper atmosphere, and send the numbers north. For weeks, the data was boring. Background counts, temperature curves, the white noise of a frozen sky. Then the pulses started. One night, just after local midnight, a sensor set to monitor cosmic radiation began picking up a repeating spike, sharp, precise, arriving at exact intervals. It did not match solar flares. It did not match cosmic rays. It rose out of the baseline like a heartbeat. At first, they thought it was a glitch. They checked grounding, replaced cables, even swapped the instrument entirely. The signal stayed. Every few minutes, spike, decay, silence over and over, as if something above the station was switching on and off. One of the researchers, a soft-spoken physicist with decades of fieldwork behind him, wrote in his notebook, "Pattern too regular to dismiss. Source unknown." The next day he logged a second line, "Feels artificial." When they transmitted the data back to the States, the response came faster than usual. A terse message: "Recheck calibration, do not release preliminary plots, continue recording. No interpretation, no theory, just a warning not to talk." The pulses intensified. Some nights the spikes climbed so high they nearly maxed the sensor. On others, they vanished completely, leaving only an echo of static in the system, like something stepping in and out of range. A second instrument, aimed at a different part of the sky, briefly recorded the same pattern before dropping back to normal. Then a storm hit. For 3 days, the station shook under winds that sounded like a constant low scream. When it cleared, the pulses were gone. Weeks later, a courier plane arrived with an unusual order. All primary tapes, logbooks, and handwritten notes related to the anomaly were to be sent back for central analysis. The team complied, but several members quietly kept copies of their rough graphs, developed in the tiny darkroom wedged between storage and the sleeping quarters. Years passed. Some of those copies resurfaced in private conversations, blurred photographs of radiation plots, a page of lab notes with a line hastily underlined 3 times. Not instrumental, external. But when one former team member tried to access the official archive, the response was almost identical to what had greeted other inconvenient discoveries. No such records are currently available. Publicly, nothing unusual was ever reported from that winter. No paper was published, no anomaly acknowledged. Just another season on the ice, another year of quiet data. Yet a rumor still circulates among a small circle of atmospheric scientists that for a brief cold window in 1983, something over the Antarctic plateau flickered in a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Something that came on, went off, and then vanished as soon as higher eyes turned to look. Because numbers can be erased, tapes can be boxed and buried, but the sky does not forget what passed through it. And when the readings fell back to zero, the feeling that something had been there never really left. The forbidden map that redrew a continent. When the Piri Reis map was first unrolled on a long wooden table inside Topkapi Palace, the archivists examining it expected nothing more than a beautifully illustrated artifact, an Ottoman admiral's confident rendering of the world as he understood it in 1513. But within minutes, one of them leaned closer, traced a trembling finger along the lower coastline and whispered the question that would follow the map for the next century. How did he know what this looked like? Because the southern edge of the chart, drawn with unnerving accuracy, appears to describe a coastline that should have been impossible for anyone of the 16th century to depict. The landmass we now recognize as Antarctica, without its ice. At first, historians attributed the precision to chance or artistic embellishment. But when the contours were digitally compared to modern seismic readings of Antarctica's subglacial coast, something troubling emerged. The shapes aligned far too closely for guesswork. Bays, curvatures, and peninsulas, features hidden beneath thousands of feet of ice, seemed to mirror what Piri Reis had inked centuries before satellites existed. The admiral himself didn't claim authorship. In the notes scrawled along the margins, he wrote that he compiled the map using 20 older charts, some said to come from forgotten libraries, others from sailors who spoke of lands no longer reachable. But none of those source maps have ever been found, and many scholars quietly doubt the idea that medieval explorers could have charted a frozen, uninhabited continent in such detail, let alone one buried beneath ice since long before recorded history. By the mid-20th century, military analysts in the United States and Europe began studying the map in classified settings. These were not historians, they were cartographers trained to detect accuracy, deception, and impossibility. Several of them reportedly concluded that parts of the coastline matched modern measurements within a margin far too small to ignore. One internal memo, later referenced by a retired naval officer, described the southern region of the map as incompatible with 16th century knowledge. Attempts to publish academic papers on the anomaly often stalled. Proposals were returned with requests to avoid claims that could mislead the public or encourage pseudoscience. In private, some researchers admitted they weren't rejecting the data, they were avoiding the implications. If the map was accurate, someone had charted Antarctica before it froze, or someone had passed down knowledge from a source far older than any civilization we acknowledge. Even stranger were the updates. As digital imaging improved, high-resolution scans revealed details previously missed, faint lines beneath the ink, suggesting the outline was copied from an even earlier template. Layers of annotation hinted at coastlines extending beyond what Piri Reis ultimately committed to parchment. Then there were the documents that disappeared. In the 1930s, two scholars working with the map reported that additional fragments, possibly companion charts, had been misplaced between departments. They were never recovered. The incident was quietly dismissed as clerical error, yet the map remains. A single sheet of gazelle skin carrying a coastline no one was meant to see, drawn by a man who never claimed the knowledge as his own. Historians still strive to anchor it to known sources, but each attempt raises more questions than it answers. Because if the Piri Reis map truly reflects land beneath the Antarctic ice, then it is not just a cartographic mystery, it is a message, one passed across centuries, copied by hands that did not understand its origin, preserved by chance, and rediscovered at a moment when technology could finally recognize what it showed. A whisper from a world older than history, but if a map can reveal what was hidden beneath miles of ice, what else might be waiting beneath the surface of our past? The desert structure no one will claim. The Utah backcountry is a place of eroded cathedrals, stone spires, split canyons, sandstone walls older than language itself. Rangers call it the quiet zone, not because it is silent, but because sound gets lost there. It folds into the canyons, swallowed by the heat, leaving visitors with the unsettling sense that something is listening. So when a flight crew conducting a wildlife survey spotted a metallic shape glinting between the red cliffs in 2011, they assumed it was debris from a crashed aircraft. It wasn't. Wedged inside a narrow slot canyon stood a 3-meter column of seamless metal, its surface polished enough to catch the sun in a razor line. It had no bolts, welds, logos, or seams. It wasn't planted in the sand. It was embedded in the canyon floor, as though the rock had grown around it. The pilot reportedly said, "That wasn't here last season," and they landed to check it. Up close, the structure felt even stranger. The metal was warm despite the shade. Compass needles drifted when brought near it. A ranger who touched it described a faint vibration, like a distant engine, though no such sound appeared on audio recordings. The team took photographs, measurements, and GPS coordinates, preparing to file an incident report. But when they contacted their supervisor, they received an unusual reply: "Document minimally, do not escalate." For years, nothing happened. The structure stood in the canyon, unclaimed, unmapped, unknown, visited only by a handful of personnel who stumbled onto it during survey flights. When one ranger mentioned it during an equipment briefing in 2015, the room reportedly fell silent before someone changed the subject. Then, in late 2020, images of the monolith leaked online. Within hours, thousands of people were trying to locate it. Within days, they succeeded. Explorers hiked out to the canyon, touched the metal, filmed it, speculated about it, and posted everything. The structure went viral. Theories ranged from art installation to military marker to something older, something that didn't belong to the landscape at all. 48 hours later, it vanished. A group of hikers arriving at sunrise found only a rectangular void pressed into the sand, edges sharp and undisturbed. No drag marks, no vehicle tracks, no footprints besides their own. The monolith had been lifted, cleanly, vertically, and taken somewhere no one has admitted. The Bureau of Land Management issued a short statement claiming no involvement. Local authorities denied responsibility. The pilot who had first seen the structure refused interviews, saying only, "It's better if people stop asking." But satellite images from the previous night showed something odd, a faint thermal signature lingering in the canyon long after sunset, as if the object, or the ground beneath it, had retained heat. Months later, other monoliths began appearing across the world. Some were crude copies, others matched the Utah structure too closely to dismiss. A few disappeared as quickly as they appeared, and one, photographed before anyone could approach it, showed surface markings the Utah column never had, thin incisions aligned like a star chart. Whether the structures were connected, orchestrated, or entirely misunderstood, no agency stepped forward to claim any of them, and the original, the one hidden for nearly a decade in a canyon where sound goes to die, has never been found again. Because sometimes an object doesn't mark a place, sometimes it marks a moment, one that was never meant to be witnessed. And when the monolith disappeared, the canyon didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting.